The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the ISO 9001-2015 Anticipating Auditor Expectations in Key Areas webinar. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of technical notes for everyone. All of our participants are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, and to do so, we ask that you use the question portion of the dashboard. We will address questions at the end of today's presentation. Now, one of the more common questions that we get, will we be able to access the slides from this presentation? This is the premiere of this webinar, so do bear with us. We're going to make the slides available as soon as possible after the presentation is complete. They should be up within a day or two. Also, if you'd like to re-watch this webinar with voiceover, we do have all past webinars hosted on our YouTube page, and that can be accessed through the main website, www.pjr.com. Our topics for today, I have a couple of opening comments that I'd like to share on ISO 9001. We have a disclaimer on our data sampling for today's presentation. And then I'm going to take you through an examination of some key areas. We're going to look at management review. We're going to look at internal audit, a couple of other areas. I've saved some content from past presentations that pertains to risk and interested parties. These, of course, are the two really key new requirements that came with the 2015 version of the standard. We're going to discuss leadership's role in the audit process and in the system at large, a few concluding remarks, and then your questions. So, I want to start with recognizing that ISO 9001-2015 is an interpretive document. And in ISO 9001 has been an interpretive document from the first day it was published. Now, what makes 9001-2015 unique is that it was the first ISO 9001 standard to include an explanatory appendix. If you look at Appendix A, there are 8 special explanations that are offered for various topics. ISO 9001-2015 has gone on to become one of the only ISO published standards to have a separate supplemental standard, which we're going to talk about here on the next slide. That supplemental standard is called ISO/TS 9002-2016. Now, this document was published on November 1st, 2016. We'll be referring to it in a few more places in our presentation as ISO 9002. Its full title is Quality Management Systems Guidelines for the Application of ISO 9001-2015. It is an officially sanctioned guidance document, and it's unique in that it provides clause-by-clause ideas on fulfilling the requirements of the ISO 9001 standard. So it's very unique in that regard. It is similar in content. Anybody who's been involved with ISO 9001 for any period of time, you may remember the 2000 version of the 9004 standard. Very similar to that document. Now, because ISO 9001-2015 is an interpretive document, the idea, of course, is that the requirements therein need to be interpreted. And by manner of extension, by way of extension, none of the requirements has a perfect method for implementation. Each organization that uses ISO 9001 has to decide for itself how it's going to implement those requirements. Now, the role of the auditor in this, of course, is to consider what the organization chose to do for the various requirements and exercise some judgment as to whether or not it is a true fulfillment of the requirement. Now, one of the areas that comes up often is the discussion of procedures and work instructions. And I'm sure many of you on the call have procedures. Perhaps all of you have procedures for one topic or another within your organization. In the 2015 version of ISO 9001, one of the more interesting changes was that the last of the required procedures was officially eliminated. Now, if you dial the clock back to 1987, when ISO 9001 was first published, there were 16 required procedures at that time. When the 2000 version was issued, that was reduced to 6, and now there are no officially required procedures. Now, we always like to add that if an organization chooses to have a procedure or a work instruction for any activity, the content of that procedure can be cited in the context of an audit. So, for example, if you choose to have a management review procedure and you indicate within that procedure that you are going to have a management review meeting once a month, well, we're going to hold you accountable to that. And that is due partially to the requirement for audit criteria and how audit criteria is defined in the 9000 supplemental document. Criteria is defined as policies, procedures, or requirements that are used as a reference against which the objective evidence is compared. So in other words, if you write a procedure and you state that we're going to have monthly management reviews and you're not having them, we can hold you accountable to that procedure and write a nonconformance, even though the standard doesn't require a procedure for management review, and it certainly doesn't require that management reviews be held every month. Now, ISO 9001 2015 has been in print 3 years. It has been in print for over 3 years now. That's really quite incredible. And it's even more incredible to consider that ISO 9001 has been in print for 30 plus years. We've been working with this standard. Now, in spite of all that time and in spite of all of the work that's been done by various companies to implement ISO 9001, to consult for ISO 9001 and so forth, many of the same things continue to be cited in the ISO 9001 audits year after year. In early 2018, PJR conducted a data mining exercise. We used about 350 audits covering the prior 12 months, back to about October 2017. And we looked at where were the nonconformances being written. And the top 5 most commonly cited general areas were uncovered. The number 1 area where nonconformances were written was management review, followed by internal audits, followed by quality objectives, followed by calibration or verification of measuring resources, and lastly, external provider approvals. Now, it's interesting to note that 3 of those items, management review, internal audit, and calibration, are all legacy requirements. They have all been included in ISO 9001 all the way back to 1987 when ISO 9001 was first published. So again, recognizing that it is an interpretive document and PJR cannot advocate specific methodologies for implementation of any requirement from ISO 9001 2015 or any other standard for that matter, it is proposed that we can attempt to provide some clarity on what these requirements are commonly interpreted to mean and how they are commonly fulfilled. So what we're going to be doing on the next several slides, this should not be taken as an endorsement of approach, and it certainly cannot be used as justification for any circumstance cited by an auditor within an official nonconformance. Now, we are going to be discussing a little bit later in the presentation how you can file for an impartial resolution of a disputed nonconformance. We'll cover our disputes process a little bit later in our presentation. So let's begin with the most commonly cited item in our data pool for nonconformances, and that is management review. Management review, of course, is found in clause 9.3 of ISO 9001:2015, and it has 3 subclauses, which we will refer to as parts. In part 1, it states that you will review the quality management system at planned intervals to ensure continued suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, and alignment with the strategic direction of the organization. Now, from this, I've chosen to highlight planned intervals. The key item here is planned intervals. Now, that statement intends that the organization have some manner of control for the frequency and the content of the management review. Now, with just like anything else in ISO 9001, what those actual controls are going to be are at your discretion. So this could include internal schedules, it could include procedural stipulations, automated reminders, maybe a combination therein. But you have to have something in place that constitutes planned intervals. Now, in part 2, the content of the management review is specified. We have a long list of things that you're required to discuss: customer satisfaction, nonconformances, corrective actions, audit results, external provider performance, and so forth. Now, each of the content items is considered mandatory, but it is not a requirement that every item be included in every management review. A lot of organizations find that it's helpful to have a PowerPoint presentation or some other presentation of relevant content. Now, you'll note that that is not mandatory. A lot of organizations use a standardized agenda format to make sure that nothing is forgotten or missed. That is not mandatory either. Again, you have to decide for yourself what your controls are going to be. Now, the last part of the requirement says that the management review has to include decisions and actions. And this is a very key point. This is supposed to be a productive meeting. I always like to highlight also this whole idea that we need to make some decisions, take some actions. This is not supposed to be just a churn of information. So when our auditors review the evidence of the management review, they need to see that decisions and actions were made. And furthermore, there needs to be, as I've also highlighted here, retained documented information. That's ISO speak for records. You need to have records of your management review. And those records need to include some indication of what the decisions and actions were as a result of the management review meeting. Let's continue with the primary clause for internal audit. This was the second most cited item in the nonconformances. Now, internal audit is split up into 2 primary pieces. And again, I've highlighted some of the key items here. First of all, internal audits need to be done at planned intervals. They need to provide information on whether the quality management system, and again, you'll note that's underlined, conforms both to your own requirements and the requirements of the standard, and if the quality management system is effectively implemented and maintained. So let's pick this apart a little bit. Again, a key point is planned intervals. The internal audits also have to be scheduled. There has to be something that shows they are planned. Now, this could be calendar triggers, this could be audit plans, this could be database scheduling, some combination therein. Now, in a similar respect to the management review meeting, you are permitted to do the internal audit in small bites. If you've got 12 processes in your quality management system and you're going to do 1 per month, that's fine. but it needs to be planned out in such a way that that is shown that this is what you're going to be doing. Now, I always like to point out the inclusion of the requirements of the international standard. The expectation is that you are going to ensure that all requirements from ISO 9001:2015 are included in the internal audit process. And a common mistake that we see is that you audit your whole system, but you forget to audit the internal audit process itself. You are indeed expected to audit the audit. That is one of the requirements of ISO 9001. Now, I also like to point out that the audit is expected to be performed against the quality management system. The verbiage is you shall audit the quality management system. Now, remember, ISO 9001 establishes that a quality management system is made up of processes. This is called out in clause 4.4.1, where it states that the organization shall determine the processes that are needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization. So therefore, it is expected that you should structure your internal audit with respect to the processes that make up the quality management system. You should be doing process-based internal audits. Now, the second part of the internal audit requirement, there's a couple of key items here as well. You're supposed to select auditors and conduct your audits in such a way that impartiality is provided. You should take correction and corrective action against any nonconformances that are raised, and you should have, again, here's a record statement, retain documented information. So let's take a further look at these ideas. Now, you'll note that ISO 9001:2015 does not specify any minimum requirement for auditor competency. Just like any other task within the quality management system, you are expected to decide for yourself what it means for an internal audit, an internal auditor rather, to be competent. You're required to determine competency requirements. This comes from section 7.2. So whatever you establish, we're going to hold you accountable to that. And it needs to be more than just a training sign-off. You need to define what does it mean to be competent, what are the steps we're going to take, and then ensure that that competency is achieved for your internal auditors. Now, another item that comes up frequently is a lack of responsiveness to internal audit nonconformances. Now, those are to be treated with the same seriousness that is afforded to nonconformances that are issued in an official CB audit or, frankly, to customer complaints. The requirements mention both correction and corrective action in this context. Correction, of course, is the immediate fix to the issue that's cited in the nonconformist, and then corrective action is the more systemic action that is taken. Now, again, this is a record-intensive requirement. You are required to keep records of the internal audit process, but the method of recording the audit is at your discretion. So if you choose to use checklists or procedural printouts or another document of your creation, whatever you use is fine, but it does have to be sufficiently detailed to give confidence that the entire quality management system was included in the audit. And this should include retaining evidence of conformity in addition to evidence of nonconformity. So in other words, we do want to see the complete picture. We want to feel confident that you audited the system, that you took samples, and so forth. Now, I always like to make a key point here as it pertains to consultants. several of our clients, probably, I would opine, probably 60% or more, choose to source their internal audit process through a consultant. Now, that's absolutely fine, but you need to remember that if you are going to outsource your internal audit process, the overall responsibility for the internal audit program is still yours. It's your job to schedule the audit, to maintain the audit records, to respond to the nonconformances. You should be able to speak confidently about your internal audit process and how it is controlled. It is not an acceptable answer in the context of an audit to say, well, our consultant does that for us. No, it's your internal audit program and you're responsible for it. Continuing on to item number 3, let's examine the primary clause for quality objectives. This is section 6.2, which also has 2 subclauses. You are required to have quality objectives at relevant functions, levels, and processes. They have to be consistent with your policy. They have to be measurable. They have to be relevant to the conformity of your products and services, as well as customer satisfaction. And this last one especially is important. They have to be monitored, communicated, and updated. So again, let's pick at this just a little bit. First of all objectives have to be measurable. Without measurability, there is no reliable way to determine if the objective was met. Now, variable measurement type objectives are most common, saying that you're going to have 95% on-time delivery, or you're going to have 2% or less scrap, things of that nature. We do also consider attribute type objectives to be acceptable also, to say, for example, that you're going to have achieve a particular certification by a particular date, is an example of an attribute type objective. Now, relevancy to customer satisfaction and products/services. This was a new idea when ISO 9001:2015 was published. Now, I always like to point out, if you want to have objectives that are rooted in things that are outside of customer satisfaction and products and services, if you want to have an objective for profitability, if you want to have an objective for safety, and so forth, that's completely fine. But you have to be sure that there are other objectives that are going to address customer satisfaction, products and services, and so forth. Now, quality objectives also, you should know, are a topic that everyone in a quality management system audit is expected to demonstrate knowledge and awareness. We are supposed to be able to ask literally anybody in the building about quality objectives, and they should be able to speak somewhat confidently on that topic and explain relevancy to what they do. Now, how do you accomplish that? Well, there's a lot of ways. You can put up signs, you can have meetings, and so forth. There is no specific methodology that's mandatory, but you have to do what is necessary for your organization to achieve an awareness of the objectives. Now, the second part of the requirement is fairly straightforward. It says that you need to determine what's going to be done and resources and so forth to achieve your quality objectives. Now, the 9002 standard, the supplemental standard, has an interesting point of clarity when it comes to the idea of what will be done. And it says that the organization should determine the actions that need to be implemented to achieve its quality objectives. So in other words, this is not something that you establish and then sit back and say, well, sure hope we do this, sure hope we accomplish this. That's not the idea. The idea is that you are actively working towards achieving your objectives, and as a team, that you are collectively working towards the achievement of your objectives. That's the big picture idea here. Now, the key overall takeaway from this is that it's not enough to simply have the established objectives. Again, you must track progress achieved towards them, and you must take necessary action to improve objectives if they are underperforming. Now, necessary action means an appropriate response. It doesn't necessarily mean formal corrective action. When we conduct our audits, we always look at objectives, we always look at current performance, and we try to get a sense of, okay, if the objectives are not being met, what's being done about it? What are the actions, response actions, that the organization is taking? Moving on then to our fourth category, and that is monitoring and measuring resources. Now, this requirement is most commonly referred to as calibration. Monitoring and measuring resources, essentially, it refers to any device, tool, gauge, meter, scale, etc. that's used to perform monitoring and measurement of outputs. Now, this is most commonly referred to as inspection and/or testing. Now, our primary clause for this is section 7.1.5. So again, let's take a look at the verbiage from the standard. In the first part, it says that you need to determine what is needed to provide measurement results and to make sure that your product and or service is meeting the requirements. The key part here is this statement: you shall retain appropriate documented information as evidence of fitness for purpose of the measurement and monitoring resources. So what that means in plain English is you need records. You need calibration or verification records for all measurement devices. Now, as far as what's in those records, to that we look to the second part of the requirement. And I apologize for the size of the font here. It's a rather wordy clause. It says that where the measurement traceability is required, the measuring equipment shall be, and here's where the key requirements are. It shall be calibrated or verified, or both, at specified intervals or prior to use against measurement standards that are traceable to international or national measurement standards. And additionally, it shall be identified in order to determine status. Those two sentences are the two most oft violated aspects of this requirement. First, traceability to national or international standards. Now, here in the United States, this is going to be the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. When we look at calibration certificates, when we look at calibration records, we are looking for the NIST code to ensure that it is a traceable link back to the NIST for this calibration. Now, there are rare instances where there is no established NIST standard for the measurement device. This is becoming exceptionally rare. Where that is the case, it is typically acceptable for the device to be calibrated by the original manufacturer. Now, the other item that comes up a lot is consistent and reliable device identification. Now, one of the more common misconceptions in this is that we mean calibration stickers by this. We don't. What it means is that there has to be some form of device identification that permits traceability to the calibration records. There's a lot of ways to do that, and again, calibration stickers are not mandatory. Our final category of requirement from the data pool is external provider approvals. Now, in the older versions of ISO 9001, we had a couple of different ways of referring to these folks. Suppliers, subcontractors, outside partners, and so forth. In some cases, the requirements that were associated with those parties resided in separate parts of the standard. In 9001-2015, these terms were merged under the collective heading of external provider, and the requirements for these parties were collected into a single place, and that is clause 8.4.1. 8.4.1 states that the organization needs to determine and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring of performance, and reevaluation of external providers. And then it goes on to say the organization shall retain documented information of these activities. And that's very critical. Documented information of these activities. So let's explore this. First of all, you're required to establish a methodology for external provider approval. You have to decide for yourself how you are going to evaluate and approve the external providers. And again, that's at your discretion. The requirement calls not just for initial evaluation, but for monitoring and reevaluation. And finally, you are required to retain documented information of these evaluation activities. In other words, putting an external provider's name on a list is not evidence of evaluation. It is not evidence of the evaluation activity. The actual evaluation event is supposed to be on the record as well. That's why the requirement is worded in the manner that it is. Now, as I mentioned at the lead-in to my presentation, I had two other areas that I wanted to explore, and these are risk and interested parties. These are highlighted really as the key new requirements that come along with the 9001 2015 standard. The term risk is used a total of 16 times in the auditable portion of ISO 9001:2015. Risk is viewed really more as a system-wide strategy. It is emphasized that a formal risk management process is not required. The idea really is more of risk aversion. Now, 9002 discusses risks as failure of processes or products or services to meet the requirements, or if an organization is not achieving customer satisfaction. That's really the big picture in terms of the risk idea. So in the 9001 standard, risk is discussed in clause 6.1, and it's discussed really in a couple of key ways. It says that, first of all, when you're planning for the quality management system, you need to consider the issues that are referred to in section 4.1. This means both those that come from inside and outside the organization, and the requirements that are referred to in 4.2. This means those that come both from internal interested parties and external interested parties. And from that, determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. And I always like to emphasize that both of those terms are used here, risks and opportunities. And that's further exemplified in subclauses B and C below. This is not just avoiding negative events. This is also taking advantage of good things and spreading it around, so to speak. So enhancing desirable effects, that would be more of an opportunity. Obviously, preventing or reducing undesired effects, well, that is more of a risk. And the big picture here, of course, is assurance that your system is going to achieve its intended results and overall achieving improvement. In 6.1.2, it goes on to state that you will plan actions on addressing those risks and opportunities. And here is a very key phrase: integrating and implementing those actions into your processes. Again, the expectation is not that you're going to have a formal risk management process, but rather that you are going to have a methodology for determining what the risks are and opportunities, and then integrating those into your processes. So what do they mean by actions to address risks and opportunities? Well, for this, I like to turn again to the 9002 guidance standard. And the guidance standard breaks this down into 5 key possibilities in terms of what you could do. Risk avoidance. You could just stop doing whatever that process is. Limitation of risk. You can establish procedures or work instructions to try to guide your staff and reduce the likelihood of the event occurring. You could share the risk. You could work with your customers. You could work with your external providers, for example, to agree to bulk purchasing of raw materials if that happens to be the risk. Risk transfer could be maintaining insurance or having other similar arrangements. And then finally, risk acceptance. When you've taken the reasonable steps, the reasonable measures, accepting the residual risk that remains and evaluating what is that residual risk. So how is this audited? We have instructed our auditors to essentially to ask an open-ended question and to inquire, what have you established for risk within your quality management system? We expect our clients to understand this concept. We expect you to have your arms around what is this all about and be able to explain what approach you've taken. Now, there are two clauses that pertain to evidence of risk and where risk is called out specifically and where it has to be on the record. And that is in section 9.3.2 subclause E, where it states that effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities needs to be discussed in management review. And then, of course, management review has to be on the record. We have to have retained documented information of management review. As far as interested parties are concerned, interested parties are defined as people or organizations that can be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. Now, some of the examples that are given include customers, owners, suppliers, competitors, and so forth. Now, in section 4.2 of ISO 9001, it states that the organization has to determine who their interested parties are, but it does emphasize those that are relevant to the quality management system. So the intent here is that as an organization, you're going to ensure that your quality management system considers the relevant input requirements. Interested party, that term really is intended to broaden the scope in terms of who you're going to consider. Where are these requirements coming from? Obviously, this is simply good business. And we do like to emphasize that for a majority of organizations, to conclude that the customer base is the only interested party is likely inappropriate. Now, we do not reject it out of hand. If an organization comes back to us and says that the customers are the only interested party group, we're going to ask, what process did you use to arrive at this conclusion? How did you perform the analysis and arrive at this decision that the customer base was the only relevant interested party? Now, if we can't see evidence that any kind of structured analysis was done, it's very likely that that process was flawed and potentially a nonconformance will be issued. Now, 9002, I like to throw this list up just for consideration, provides an even more extensive list on potential interested parties, talking about unions and franchisors and community groups and so forth. Now, 9002 also provides some very good guidance on determining who the interested parties are and what their needs are. And we use this to an extent in our audit process, reviewing the orders that you're getting from your customers, reviewing applicable statutory regulatory requirements, lobbying, networking, market surveillance, supply chain relationships, user surveys, and so forth. Lots of ways to get relevant information into your organization so that you can respond to the needs of the interested parties. Now, is it possible to get a nonconformance pertaining to interested parties? There are two circumstances where a nonconformance is potentially warranted. The first of these is if we do not see any evidence of a process for monitoring and reviewing information. This would fall under Section 4.2. Additionally, if we did not see any evidence of interested party feedback being discussed within management review, that would fall under Section 9.3.2, subclause C1. So again, two primary clauses. One more item I'd like to discuss, and that is leadership. This whole idea of leadership and management. There's some really key items, some important items that have been written into Section 5.1. So how has PJR approached leadership? Well, our audit report includes several targeted questions that auditors are expected to ask the management team under the heading Leadership Interview. It also directs our auditors to ensure that leadership is involved in the management of the quality system. So what are these questions? There are 5 of them in total. They're broken up into 4 places, and they are as follows. What are you specifically doing to make yourself accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system? How do you participate in the quality management system? Who are the primary interested parties of your organization? Do you have a process in place to monitor interested party requirements and to respond to those requirements? And what are some of the current internal and external issues that you are attempting to address within your organization? All essentially taken from sections 4 and 5 of the 9001 standard. Now, when we say leadership, we mean leadership. We don't mean just the president. We don't mean just the CEO. Unless it is an exceptionally small company, we want to have the leadership team. It's really inconceivable that a company in excess of 10 to 20 people is going to not have a team that is responsible for running the organization and that acts as leadership. Now, in terms of some further guidance on leadership from 9002, 9002 provides clarification on the role of top management. And it states that although certain authorities and responsibilities can be delegated, the accountability remains with top management. So the reason I bring this up, we still get asked from time to time, are we allowed to appoint a management representative? And the short answer to that is yes. You can still have a management representative. What you can't do is dump the system on that person's lap and walk away and not have any accountability or responsibility for the quality management system. So what happens if we don't agree? If we arrive at a nonconformance and we've looked at all the evidence and the auditor is convinced that there is a legitimate nonconformance and the auditee is convinced that there is no nonconformance. PJR is required to provide a process for an impartial review of contested nonconformities. Our process is contained in procedure Pro-10. Pro-10 is available for download on our website under the link Registration Document Download. If you go to pjr.com, at the very bottom of the page, look for the link Registration Document Download. You will find Pro-10. Now, Pro-10 stipulates that all disputes have to be received within 15 days. That's calendar days of the end of the audit. So one piece of advice, when you get your nonconformances, read them immediately. Make sure that you completely understand what the nonconformance was written for. And if by chance you are going to file a dispute for one or more of your nonconformances, you have to do so within 15 calendar days. So in conclusion, ISO 9001:2015 remains the world's most utilized standard. There are unbelievably just over 1.3 million registered companies worldwide. Many of the items that are cited in nonconformances are entirely avoidable and seem to come up time and again. We do hope that the content of today's presentation will leave you feeling more confident that things will go well on audit day. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have a presentation called Non-Applicable Clauses, Exclusions, Exemptions, developing a better understanding of what can and cannot be excluded in an audit assessment. That is shown roughly once per quarter. Talks about exemptions and the right way to determine which ones apply to you. We also have a very popular presentation called The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. This webinar is an examination of processes and how to correctly understand them. We have webinars on a lot of other topics. We have corrective action, stage 1 auditing, AS 9100, IATF 16949, and so forth. We have a lot of content for you. Would you like to keep in touch with PJR? If you want to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, we would ask that you consider opting in. And you can do so by visiting our website at www.pjr.com. At the bottom of the page, if you enter your email and click subscribe, you'll be automatically emailed whenever news items are emailed out, items of relevance to the standards, and other helpful information. I do thank you for your time. Couple of reminders. Copies of today's presentation will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you want to re-watch this webinar, it's going to be posted to our YouTube page as soon as possible. You can link to that YouTube page at our website, www.pjr.com. Look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard here. Let's see what we've got. Jill Blevins asks, can internal auditors be trained by a certified QMS lead auditor within the company? Jill, in terms of qualifying an auditor, whatever methodology you choose to deploy is up to you. I'd say that certainly that sounds like an acceptable approach to me. You would just have to be prepared to demonstrate that it meets your internal requirements and that it's effective, that whoever is being trained to perform the internal audit is doing an effective job. Okay. Brenda Bonpatra asks, what is the minimum time period between 2 management review meetings and internal audits? Well, you are permitted to set your frequency on internal audits and management reviews essentially however you wish. Again, the important part for us as a certification body is, are those 2 processes effective? Any other questions today? Okay. Brenda Bond, you're quite welcome. And everyone, thank you for your time today. Have a great day.